Welcome to another episode of Recovered Life. I am Damon Frank, and I am here with Kevin Kline, spiritual transformation coach. How you doing today, Kevin?
I'm wonderful. Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much for coming on the show. You know, we have been having a conversation for the last couple weeks about the spiritual principles that could be applied to recovery from an exciting book that you're reading called When Things Fall Apart. Tell us a little bit about the book.
Well, When Things Fall Apart is written by Pema Chodron, and she is a Buddhist teacher with many, many years of her own learning, her own experience, and being able to translate that in a very accessible manner so that people can read it. And it could be difficult to sort of grapple with some of this stuff and make it apart, because when we do work, sometimes it's hard.
Yeah, what I loved about this when we first started talking, what I really loved about it was the title. I mean, honestly, you got me at the title, because so much of recovery is watching things fall apart and finding out how to kind of rebound from that and how to kind of categorize that in your own mind. And in some ways, I'm going to say, use that as a powerful force in your life.
Correct. And the biggest takeaway, I believe, from this book is that things are always going to fall apart, and they're going to come back together, and they're going to be different. Then they're going to fall apart again. They're going to come back, and it's just this series of life's ebbs and flows. And when we can really come to understand that and not try to fight it, then we have a greater expression of freedom in our life. It's when we, try to work it or manipulate it, think, oh, if I do this or do that, then somehow my life will be okay, or it'll be better, or I'll be safer, or whatever the minutia is in our heads.
Exactly right. Kevin, one of the questions I was going to ask you was, as a spiritual transformation coach, one of the big things that you had brought up to me was about when things fall apart was ego. What tips can you give us here as an expert about dealing with ego and things falling apart?
Well, if you try to fight the ego, you will always lose. Always. No ifs, ands, or buts. It's only when we acknowledge, one, that exists, two, that it is never going away, three, that it thinks that its only job is to keep us safe and out of harm's way, and that when we can learn to accept that and make friends with the ego and acknowledge that it is trying to share, and then what I have said, thanks for sharing, now go to your room, and just move on with what I know is a higher thought. If I try to fight it.
Yeah. So are you saying that the ego is always talking to you? Is that the ego is constantly talking with you, and in recovery, a lot of times we're fighting what that's saying, right?
Well, it used to always fight with me. It doesn't anymore for me. I mean, it'll come up, it'll say something, and I'll laugh, because it's trying to share something absurd, like I have manipulation power over another human being, or that if I do something a certain way, that I can make a situation better, under my own ego power. And that's a lie. It's a lie. And, I've been around long enough where I just laugh at it now. I catch myself and then just move on. It doesn't have a lot of power in my life. I would love to say it has none, but the truth is because it never goes away. It just for me, just trying to make friends with it and to acknowledge that it really believes it's trying to do the best for me.
That's interesting. That is interesting, because one of the things that is a common topic in recovery and with recovered people is the ego. And I think sometimes we look at the ego as 100% enemy. It's like, this is the person that I'm fighting all the time. And if the ego wins, everything is going to be terrible. And I guess I'd like to hear your thoughts on that, because what you're saying is the ego sometimes can be your friend and it can give you signs.
Well, the ego, sorry, I'm sliding. The ego, um, the ego is part of the human function so that we won't like stick our hands in fire, or run in front of a raging dinosaur. I mean, there are things, or eat the wrong kind of food because, intuitively we know that's poisonous, right? So the ego has an absolute place in the human function. It's been over the course of time and growth, I'll say, that as human beings have learned to understand that they think and learned that they could learn, and they started expanding things, that the ego started to grapple with, well, wait a minute, but is that safe? So and then coupled with everything that we learn in childhood that is going on in the back of our heads, right? And sometimes on a tape, sometimes not, that the ego then thinks it's got a bigger sense of responsibility than it
Yeah.
really needs to have.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
no one comes into recovery because everything's is great. Usually,
Right.
why I so much love this topic is that really people come into recovery and everything does fall apart. And many people feel that they're going to first come into recovery, they're going to get sober, and that everything is going to be hunky dory. But what most people learn is that it's a series of things falling apart, especially at the beginning and sometimes in rapid succession.
Well, yeah, and actually, I think that's wonderful. It's like people talk about having breakdowns. They're not; they're breakthroughs. We come into a recovery program of whatever kind, and we've got this death grip on our lives. Because we've been so afraid for so long, and the only way that can get better is if it falls apart, and we're open to different and new things. As long as we're hanging on to things, we have no choice. We have no room for growth.
Yeah, letting go is probably one of the biggest spiritual lessons that I have learned in recovery. And actually looking at things falling apart. I know we had a personal conversation a couple of months ago, and I was sharing that I was actually excited that certain things were starting to fall apart in my life because it meant new things were going to appear.
Yes.
Yeah. How does, my last question for you regarding ego is how do you handle in recovery and process when you're the most vulnerable, when things are falling apart, when you feel like you're not getting what you want or need, and that ego then all of a sudden pops up and says, knock, knock, here I am. Let me tell you what to do. How do you, as a spiritual coach, what's your advice on dealing with that?
Well, first, I think it's actually going to say, I told you so. If I think for most people, the ego, well, you know what? I told you. And, because it predicts, because we have habitual thinking. How do I say this?
When you say that, when we have habitual thinking, are you really talking about the same conversations that are coming up over and over and over again? And that could be negative things. That could be go out and do something destructive, right? As a response to things falling apart. But what specifically do you do when those come up? What's the process that you do to analyze what message the ego is trying to give you and put that in the right category, the right place in your life?
Well, when I first came in, I couldn't distinguish any particular voice in my head. It was all one loud scream, and so it just was overwhelming. And I would just run to meetings and be with people, and I didn't want to be alone with my head. It was a dark alley to go down. Didn't want to go there, and that worked for a while, and then I did the process of my writing and sharing and therapy and everything else, and I learned to distinguish between the ego voice and the still small voice. And because I can do that, it was a process of, when I would catch myself, I would pray, and then I would pray, and then I would pray. My first and best tool is prayer.
That's powerful. So that's your go-to. When your ego feels like it's overwhelming you, you immediately go into a spiritual practice.
Absolutely.
Excellent. Well,
Absolutely.
that's a major takeaway for everybody.
Yeah, because if we think the ego has power, the ego tells us it has power. That's a human construct. It's in the world of effects, and it really has zero power. The only power that we have, that we've been told over and over again, is when we're in alignment with our higher power, or I call God. And that's the only thing that honestly works, in my opinion.
Well, what I love about the advice, and what I feel is so helpful, especially to new people in recovery, is being able to identify, okay, hey, that's the ego talking to me, and not try to spend all of your energy trying to shut that out and shut it down. To actually, a huge tip that you just said here on this episode is to acknowledge it, have a conversation with it, and understand what it is and what it's maybe trying to do, and lighten up a little bit regarding that, right? We don't have to totally block it out. We can listen to it, put it in its place, have a conversation, and say, you know what? Thanks so much for the advice, but I'm not going to take it this time.
Right. Yeah. Absolutely.
Oh, great. Thank you, Kevin.
And laugh.
And laugh. Exactly. And hopefully doing a lot of that in recovery. Thank you, Kevin. I really appreciate it. This has been an amazing episode of Recovered Life. And if you want to know more about Kevin, you could reach him on Recovered Life, and we will post that here in the stream. Thanks so much. Bye, Kevin.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Keep the conversation going. Join Recovered Life, a community of like-minded people who are looking to live their best recovered lives. Membership is free, and you can apply at recoveredlife.us.